Perfect. Yep, go
So,
ahead.
so John Winchell comes to us from Eden, New York. He's a graduate of the Ohio State University. He's been a dairy cattle nutritionist for over 25 years. He has focused on forage quality for 20 years and is nationally recognized for his harvest analytics and forage harvest timing. He has a reputation for troubleshooting herd and forage challenges. John is a very popular speaker throughout North America. He's also had many articles published in Progressive Dairyman and Progressive Forages. John currently works for Alltech, and he has sales and on-farm support responsibilities for northeastern USA, as well as being the Alltech World as being on the Alltech World Mycotoxin team. He is also part of the USA Alltech Inoculant team. So thank you very much, John, for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the time. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. And if you can't, just turn off or if you don't want to hear what you're hearing, just put me on mute. So we'll be pretty good with that. So I appreciate the opportunity as always to talk with you, Sterling, and everyone else that's on here. I'm starting to become very fond of the Maritimes and Nova Scotia, PEI, etc. It's becoming one of my frequent stops, it seems like, and I like that. And it's always nice to see how things are fed and done in different areas. And I think that's probably one of the best parts of my job, which I would challenge anybody to love what they do more than what I do. I love what I do, and it's so great to get to different places and see different things, because I think there's always a few pieces you can take out of every area you're in to take back to other areas. Not everything is going to work everywhere, but I think little bits and pieces of things can work in many different areas. So that's one of the things that I think I take the most pride in, is learning every day from the farms that I go to, because there's always something very interesting that you can learn, no matter really what it is. So, but again, thank you for having me. Thank you for Belisle, Scothorn Nutrition, Agromart up in Truro. I appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to it. And if there are questions, you can for sure put questions into the chat if you need to. And then I'm sure Sterling has a few questions that were sent in prior to this that we can go over at any time. And like I said, I've been waiting for this all week, and I'm really looking forward to present. And so let's move along a little bit. So I think when you look at forages, no matter what forage types you're using, whether it's dry hay, whether it's haylage, whether it's corn silage, whether it's sorghum, whether it's cereal grains, or a combination of everything, I am convinced now more than ever in my 20 whatever plus years of doing nutrition and on-farm support and forage troubleshooting, that everything starts and finishes on the forage side. We are as good as we are on forage. We always talk about, a cow is as good as what she eats, and a cow is only as good as her home. But part of that home, to me, starts on this side of the forages. And no matter what anyone says, nutritionists have a job to balance the diet and utilize the on-farm feeds the best that we can and the best that they can. But it does start with forage. And as a young forage or nutritionist, I used to think I could outbalance anything. And you learn after a while, taking a few nicks and losing your job a few times, and gaining your job and losing your job and gaining it back at times, that you learn that having an agreement with the dairymen and forages make a big difference in what they do. So before I even talk about this, I want to stress the importance of becoming intimate with your own forages. And why I say that is you have to be part of your forage program. I understand we all make forages. We've been doing it for years. Our fathers have been doing it for years, our uncles, our grandfathers for generations. But we really have to understand why we're making the forage, and how we can make that forage better instead of just making forage when we can, letting Mother Nature be in charge, and then just hand it off and say, okay, nutritionist, please let us know, how you're going to work around this. So to me, it's a combination. It's definitely up with communication and definitely working together to make the beginning of your forage diet the best that we can. So every farm that I go to, I try to figure out what best fits that farm's playing field. And there may be things where the farm is done for years and years and years, and you think my playing field is set. Mother Nature has me set, my soil type has me set, my season has me set, my growing degree days has me set, but what can you offer me? And then you look at it and you think, okay, where are we at? What are we doing? You start looking at the weather, you start looking at seasonal patterns for that farm in particular, and then you start looking at their forage samples. And once you take those and mix those into one big pot and look at it, there's always little things that you can take out of this. And the other part is there's many farms that I've been working with that were probably kicking and screaming when I started working with them 3 or 4 or 5 years ago on forage programs with consultants all over, really all over North America. And now 3 or 4 years later, we've tried little things and done little things, and all of a sudden things just come together. And that is really the best part because we're all working together for the same goal. And our playing field now might not have been the same playing field as we had before. So to me, I think that's a really critical part to start off with. When you look at New York, for example, because I live in Buffalo, New York, right off of Lake Erie, not far from Canada. I can see Canada from my house, actually. And you can see the differences in degree days for the corn season from May 1st to October 1st. And you can see the blue shades, the orange shades, the pinker shades, the dark red shades. There's just so much variation. And you have to make sure you know how to work with those forages, use the right forages, make sure we're harvesting at the right time for each one of those areas. So it's not unique from the Maritimes or any other area where you're going to have those hills and valleys and farther north, farther south, farther east, further west on large bodies of water changes how your forages are made. So there's plenty of things. But what gets me up in the morning, gets me going, gets me rolling every day is when you start to look at comments like this. And I get texts all the time on, you're in good shape and it really is working well when you start getting texts on forages. And I just love these type of messages because I know that it's helping the bottom line, and they've fed these feeds and they took some trust in me, and then all of a sudden those feeds made things more efficient, or we made more milk, or we reduced their feed costs, or we increased components and milk. All of these things together make that really successful for everybody. And there's a lot that goes into this too. You just can't just guess and just say when it's going to be, or you can't just use degree days to figure out when you should harvest. It's a combination of many different things that you have to actually get off the tractor, get out of the truck, and get into the field and start splitting stems and walking through fields, looking for buds, everything that we know we should do. And we probably do a lot of it, but I still say that is the bottom line of what we still should be doing. And then a little bit of pre-harvest sampling goes a long way. When we're about a week off, 10 days off from chopping, and we know it's getting close, it's a really good idea for our nutritionist or our consultant or extension or whoever it is that's helping us out, goes and takes and cuts a sample, let's say for a grass at 4 inches, you cut the sample at 4 inches, send it into the lab, and then you have an idea of what your protein is. You have an idea what your ADF, your NDF is, your digestibility is. You have a lot of ideas what is going on. And then from there, you can easily decide when it's time to harvest by utilizing that. So pre-harvest sampling is very underutilized, but boy, oh boy, it should be used. And most of my herds that are high producing herds that are really fine tuning and dialing it in, that has become a part of what we do. And I think it's very important to what we're doing. A veterinarian can make a diagnosis, but without blood tests and without different tests, you're just assuming and making some educated guesses, yes, but it's always good to have data with that. And that's one thing that I really like to push with that. So I try to use a combination of pre-harvest sampling, of actually old school splitting stems, measuring how far the head is from coming out of the boot, and then tying that to the degree days so we have a total picture of where we're at and how we do. And we definitely know that once that works, it works well. And it's really rewarding to see that. And in fact, I got this sample just literally 15, 20 minutes ago, and I threw it into the slide set here. I did take the names off to protect the innocent and the guilty both, I suppose. So that's why when you look at the dry matter of this, it's going to be 18% dry matter because it's a fresh sample. It's a green sample. You're not going to have a dry matter when you're just taking a clipping out of the field. And one thing I like to notice is the question is, okay, when do you think we should chop? Are we ready to chop? So I say, okay, let's look at a few things right away. And so we look at crude protein, 25% crude protein. Yeah, that's pretty hot, I would say, for alfalfa or anything else. When you look at the ADF at 16.3, which is super low, because you look at good alfalfa, it's 20 protein, 30 ADF, 40 NDF is the old traditional numbers, 20, 30, 40 rule. Well, this is 25, 16, 36. And you look at the calcium level and it's 0.51, so we know it's a grass silage. So when I look at my numbers, instead of 20, 30, 40, or I look at these numbers and I say, okay, that crude protein is pretty high for a grass. That ADF is pretty low for a grass. That NDFOM is really low for a grass. So we have about really 10% where I want to see my wheelhouse to be for making grass forages or winter forages, whether it's triticale, rye, or wheat. I like to see that number between 45 and 50. So we'll just say the wheelhouse is going to be 46, 47 NDFOM. This is 36. We got about really 10% more NDF to increase. Because you could harvest this, but the problem is it makes balancing rations a nightmare, number one, because the rate of passage is just going to be so crazy on this. This is ultra pasture. This is going to be uber fresh pasture when we let them out on pasture way before we probably should. This is how this would feed. There's no hold to this feed at all. And the other important part is we're losing tonnage like crazy because this is so early, we would lose tonnage. But I think this is a great sample to look at because now we can say, okay, we're 10% off from the NDF we want to be and the NDF we are. So, okay, 10%. So what does that mean to anyone? Well, we know that NDF increases at 0.75% a day. So doesn't sound like much, but we already have the figures to put together. We've got that 10% from where our goal is to have great quality and great quantity. That benchmark that I so love, that 45 to 50 NDF on grasses and cereal grains. We got that 10%. We know that NDF increases 0.75% a day. So we're looking at that 10 days to 2 weeks time. Then the most important part is we get our phone out, and what we do then is we look at the weather forecast and make sure we fit ourselves into that forage window. Some people will play roulette and say, all right, I've got 10 days really. It's going to rain for a few days in 10 days. I want to stretch and try to get the most quantity I can. Those guys usually lose because what happens is we don't know the amount of rain we're going to get. We don't know the time of rain. And then by the time we get into the field, what we've done is we've delayed every subsequent cutting we have for the rest of the season. So to me, we have the perfect opportunity to try to get our first cutting the best we can, because that is the best feed we're going to feed on the farm. And that sets us up for harvest for the rest of the season. If we miss this window up front, we're going to miss this window all the way across, no matter how hard we try to catch up to that window. So to me, it's critical. And I love this forage sample because the digestibility is really high. The RFV is 175, which I hate using RFV for grasses and cereal grains because it does not take into account digestibility. But that 175 is crazy high because most good grasses are going to be in that 140, 150, 160 range at best on RFV, but they're going to be 200. This sample right here, and I didn't have a chance to do it, but I was going to convert it to RFQ. If this was an RFQ, we would be sitting at probably 225 RFQ, and the milk per ton is probably going to be 4,000. She would win the Super Bowl of forage right now because she's so immature, but it's a great thing to know. So
John,
yes, go
John,
ahead.
can I pause you for a second? We
Of
just have a
course.
question that came in on the NDF, and the question was that you mentioned that it increases by 0.75% per day. Was that for grasses or alfalfa? Can you specify?
Yes. So a lot of the research has been done. When you look at those numbers, sometimes we're going to have alfalfa is going to increase on the closer to that 0.5% to 0.75%. Grasses sometimes are going to be that 0.75% to 1%. Every once in a while, you're going to get those situations, Amber, where we have a higher than 1% increase in NDF per day, but that's usually those unique anomaly situations when we're close to heading, when we're getting to that point and we just get a big whack of heat, like a 35, 40 Celsius 4 or 5 day window in a row. And, but typically almost all forages are going to be in that 0.75%, going to wane one side or the other of that, but 0.75 is a really nice solid thumb rule to use to go by that. And that to me is been really tried and true, looking at thousands of fresh samples and harvested samples over the years. And part of the whole program is trying to fit everything together, whether we're doing corn silage, whether we're doing winter forages, whether we're doing grass silage or alfalfa or sorghums, any of those things. Correct timing is the best thing that you can do. And I don't know who put Stirling. Did you put this in? But anyways, this is when you make good forage right here. That's what, I don't know if I'm the one clapping or dancing, but one of these two, when we make good forage, this is what happens. So anyways, we're going to move right on. But goes right into the next slide, that 0.75% a day on the NDF side. I want to hit the sweet spot between NDF digestibility, and NDF indigestibility, the UNDF 240. UNDF 240, undigestible NDF at 240 hours. We know forage doesn't sit in a cow for 10 days. I get that. But all the work we've done through the research in different labs and different university research shows that if that feed hasn't digested in 240 hours, Stirling, is that going to digest? Shake your head yes or no. All right, thanks for joining. So anyway, so it is not going to digest. And that's the one thing we can do as nutritionists, as dairymen, as veterinarians, as consultants, as everyone, is if we can control the UNDF 240 of the entire ration, not just individual forages, we can control that rate of passage for the cow. We're going to control milk and how much milk and fat and components and how things are produced through that cow. And as we look at ration formulations, we're starting to very much look at UNDF 240 and how that rate of passage goes. I just looked at a herd. I fed a 32,000 pound herd 21, 22 years ago. I was still using Michigan State ration program Spartan. It was a DOS program back in the day when it didn't even know what digestibility was. And I took that diet because unfortunately I pack rat all my rations through the years. So I have diets going back forever. I put that diet into the modern ration balancing program and had a pretty good idea what those forages were and how they would equate to today with the numbers. And I looked at my UNDF 240 of the ration, and she was right in that sweet spot where I like it to be. So it's very interesting how far we've come, how far we're going to come. And it's still, ration programs and ration balancers are great. They aren't going to do the job completely for us. And that's why they're still part of the art to feeding cows. So having these three things together is going to help. But we're utilizing thumb rules like that NDF increases 0.75% a day. Then we start to look at, okay, well, what happens with NDFD 30? A lot of people in the industry look at their NDFD 30 like they used to look at crude protein and ADF and NDF in their forages. We know that NDFD 30 can increase or decrease 1.5 to 3% a day. Once she gets close to that head popping out, that NDF digestibility is creeping down. But what's even worse than that, UNDF 240, remember what we're spreading in the gutter or spreading in the field of that NDF, that UNDF portion of forages, it can drop 2 to 5, and I've seen even higher levels dropping per day, depending on the heat and the situation and the maturity of those plants. So we may lose a 0.75% on the NDF side, but we're losing a lot of, or gaining a lot of UNDF, losing a good amount of NDFD 30. And to me, the NDFD 12, which is that really fast, super supple, fragile parchment paper type of forage, where cows and the rumen digest this stuff so fast. Think of BMR corn silage. There's a reason why many of the farms here use BMR corn silage. It's for that soluble fiber, and that's that increase, that decrease in lignin, increase in fiber levels. And you can see that in NDFD 12 on your forages by looking at a conventional corn silage versus a BMR corn silage. There's always that typical 5% gap between that, and on a 10% usually on NDFD 30, depending on the lab. But what I am trying to do is, my goal is to make BMR haylage. It's not been invented yet, but we're inventing it right here every day. Because what we're doing is we're harvesting at the proper time, hitting that sweet spot, and we are making BMR grass silage, BMR sorghum Sudan, BMR triticale rye, somewhat to a point alfalfa, because what happens is that NDFD 12, the super fragile soluble fiber, that number, as we get closer to heading out and as that plant's getting ready to go into the reproductive phase, that number will drop before other numbers drop. You'll see the NDF 12 tick down. You'll see the UNDF 240 go up. When I see forage samples pre-harvest where the NDFD 12 is lower than I like to see it, and the UNDF 240 is higher than I like to see it, but the NDFD is still good, we missed the boat. We missed the window by 2-3 days. And those 2 or 3 days, when we're at the top of our game, those days are critical to what we do. So that's why I think it's so important. And it's really one of the keys to success, is being able to utilize that. All of these numbers are used in ration programs, but to me, there are some really good numbers here that are indicative of forage quality and hitting that bullseye in that sweet spot in forage. I like to have benchmarks that I look at. I created these benchmarks and I can share them at a later time. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I've put some benchmarks together for high producing cows, high producing forage, and they're here. And I'm going to skip over this for time's sake, but we'll have the opportunity to look at it. But it is still the same thing. It's equating to hitting that sweet spot. And that's why I talk about using pre-harvest samples, and then also taking samples right when we've chopped, just to see how it's changed in that week to 10-day time from when we pre-harvested. So we have an idea, and we're in control of our forage then. And that's a huge point that I have to make. we're in charge and we're working with the weather and we're working with our forage program instead of reacting and working against it. I utilize a lot of different graphs, and I know unfortunately they do not have Canada involved in here or the Maritimes involved in here. It's just a US program. But this is from the National Phenology Network, and we'll talk about phenology here in a minute. But phenology is basically the science of how things mature every season, whether it's leaves, whether it's birds migrating, whether it's worms coming out of the ground, whether it's flowers blooming, whether it's fruit. It is the study of how all of that happens every year at the same time every year, but not the same date every year. And that's super critical to this whole puzzle. Everything outside and all around us happens at pretty much the same time every year for itself. It doesn't have to be the same time, like I said, by calendar date, but it's going to happen due to growing degree days and heat units. And that's what growing degree days are. They're basically, the best way to put it is you take the high temperature of the day, the low temperature of the day, you average them out, and that's growing degree day units. And then you have a certain base that you use that we go off of. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. But getting back to this graph or this chart, you can see the map of the northeastern United States, and you can see the green, the light greens and the darker greens and the yellows, the tans and the dark browns. I utilize this graph from Florida all the way north and then all the way out into Oregon on helping farms hit the harvest window for their cereal grains just right. When I see that tan color start to go into the area that farm is at, you're going to be about 4 to 8 inches away on the head. The head is going to be 4 to 6 to 8 inches away from coming out of the boot. When you get into that darker brown color or the brown color, I like to see my farms into that brown, into the end of that tan color to right into that brown color just a little, because then you know you're right there. And it's an easy way to do it. You just look at the map and it kind of can give you an idea where you're at. So on a lot of these brown areas, on the darker brown side, these guys are already doing their grasses and they're going to be getting ready to do their alfalfas. So it's interesting that I can track this from roughly the beginning of January and just watch it creep north. And you can see how Ontario is sitting right in between all of that color. These guys are harvesting. They should be harvesting. They should have been harvesting for a little while now. And then you can see scrolling up into Ontario and getting into Quebec. And then you can take from Maine and go the other way. And we're getting close on the Maine side. I just had a webinar with a bunch of consultants and producers from the Northeast this morning, and they are going to be mowing next week their grasses and some of their alfalfa, depending on the weather and the mixes of grass alfalfa stand. So they're going to be getting ready to go. The ones farther up into that green, we're probably not there yet. Their dandelions are just thinking about coming out or just coming out now in a lot of those areas. I have this map that I've been using for a couple years now. We can share the link to this map. This is a map of the Maritimes that they recreated for me. This is actually made by Agromateo out of Quebec. And they used to do a really nice map of the Maritimes. The numbers are there, but they just stopped utilizing it. So I requested that they start bringing that back again. And you can see the yellow down towards the bottom of Nova Scotia, that bottom southwestern corner, you're seeing 418, 426, 427 sneaking up a little bit, turn into a more of a green color. We get into around that 14, 400s, and then we start dropping down as she gets a little bit cooler in some different areas where we're at 350, 355. And you can see most of that area is going to be in that mid threes. Usually around 250 is when you're going to start to see dandelions pop out around the house, around the barn. Then around that 300 is when you start to see them proliferate into the fields. And that's when you start to see a lot of these yellow fields from dandelions. And then by the time 400 rolls around, triticale and rye should be ready. And we should be going into the fields to make sure we're looking at the heads to see where we're at to be the harvesting. And even in the upper threes, depending on weather, because it gets tricky at this point of the season. As we get closer to June, we get more warmth, and an increasing amount of warmth comes. So those numbers will speed up a little bit compared to where they were a little bit earlier. And our friends in PEI, you can see they're a little bit into the 300s, right around that range where dandelions should be close to coming out, or maybe they've been out for a little bit now, and we're starting to get to that point. So I use this map, and you can look at it every single day. Don't look at it at night, because actually I think they reset it every day. So when I look at it at 7, 8, or 9 o'clock at night, it's blank. So I always look at it first thing in the morning, and then I can get the new numbers for the day. And it doesn't move a lot, 10, 15 points a day, sometimes up to 20, but I use this quite a bit to see where we're at. And you can see the legend down off to the right there, where we're at 400 to 450 on rye and triticale, 500 to 600 on grasses, 650 on alfalfa. We get into that budding stage. These numbers are not complete, steadfast guidelines. There's some wiggle to them, and the wiggle is from that individual season. If you know how plants grow, you obviously know that the heads will grow, and it's primarily in that last month is when we start to see them rise. I can go a month or 5 weeks in or away from harvesting, and you can find a head, but it's white and tiny, and you can barely make it out. And then we know as she gets closer to going through boot, then we start to see the awns, and we start to see it coming close and getting bigger and coming out. But when you're at this early stage, the weather is so critical to keeping and seeing how vegetative that plant stays. Whether she says, oh, I'm not quite ready to become reproductive yet, and that head stays down. That's why I don't like following flag leaf. Everyone used to use and still uses flag leaf as a way to measure when some of these grasses and winter cereals are ready. But to me, that is doing us a disservice, because I noticed that we might have a natural progression to the flag leaf, and she might still be rolled tight, but she's all the way out. And sometimes that head is going to be 2 inches. Sometimes, with the way the weather we've had over the past 3 weeks, that head might be buried. So I think it's important to split the stem and see where we are and tracking how that head progresses, because that's really what's going to pour our digestibility and how things are going to progress. So I can't stress that enough.
John, before you leave
Yes,
there,
of
that
course.
was that base
That's base
0 or
0.
base 5?
Sorry,
Okay,
base
so for
0.
those that have weather stations on their farm, they could just apply that to their data.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. And so typically base 5 or base 41 has been used for alfalfa for years as the number. You can look at plenty of research that looks at base 41 Fahrenheit, which is base 5 Celsius. But I use base 32 and base 0 because cool season grasses and leaves and dandelions and most everything else starts growing at base 32 Fahrenheit or 0 Celsius. And there's more information there the lower the number you go, because you're going to accumulate more numbers, Amber, as you go. And 5 is not going to get you quite as many numbers. There's a lot of arborists in the United States that are your backyard flower people. They use base 50 Fahrenheit or base 10. And those numbers, it's hard to figure out when things are progressing, because you're not accumulating many numbers, but actually things are growing. Grass is growing, leaves are growing, all these things are growing. But when you look at base 10, it barely moves. Base 10 is great for corn silage, sorghum, these warm cereal, warm forage, summer annual forages that you have, but it isn't really good earlier. And I like to have everything on one base. When I started this and started looking at degree days, I used base 0 for grasses or 32 Fahrenheit, and I used base 41 or 5 for alfalfa. but then I just confused the hell out of people because I was looking at 2 bases. So what I did is I moved everything to base 32 Fahrenheit or 0 Celsius because I want everything on one playing field, and I have the ability to be able to look at those numbers with a little more nuance, and they're a little more robust and dynamic because I can start a little earlier and track and be a little more accurate with that. So that's a good question. That's not a question that is asked often, but it's one that needs to be understood because if you read a lot of articles, they're going to start at 5. A lot of the websites actually start at 5, but you kind of have to know what you're dealing with. And I want to have more data and more room to be able to make informed decisions. So hope that clears that part of it up. And I can't see the questions in the chat, so I appreciate you coming out and throwing things out at me and giving me a second to breathe anyway. So I'm using Farm West, and I'm sorry I did not put I did this at 1 a.m. last night, updating it, and I didn't get a chance to put farmwest.com on here. That's what I had used for this individual site. They're a decent weather site. They do a good job on growing degree days. They do a good job on CHUs and tracking that for your individual locations. Great out in the west, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, but there's not nearly the weather stations out here in Ontario, Quebec, and especially the Maritimes. In the Maritimes, there's Kentville, there's Greenwood Airport, Halifax, St. John's, Summerside, Charlotte, either Charlottetown or Charlottetown, I think, and then Kajim, I don't know how that's pronounced, but there's only a few of them. And so it's hard to make those decisions without having a lot more weather stations. And that's why I stress having a weather station on farm, because you have your own data. And to me, that's the most important part. But it's interesting to note, I look at a historical average for Kentville, utilizing base 4 and at starting at 4.1. I sometimes start on 3.1, sometimes I start on 4.1, depending on the growing season and depending on how that heat starts up in the spring. The majority of the time I'm starting using 4.1, but this year there is some accumulation to degree days earlier than that. But this is what I was using for a base. So it compares historical 53-year average for Kentville, and then I went back and looked at 2023 and then compared it to this season. This season is the red line, the orange will be 23, and the blue line is going to be historical. So you can see how tight they really are to each other. And that's one thing I like about the Maritimes is we are cool and it is gradual. And if you want to make digestibility and you want the opportunity for digestibility, the Maritimes are where it's at. We have so much upside and benefit to where we are. I know when you're living there, you're thinking we're never going to get sunshine. It's never going to warm up, or sometimes it goes the other way. But really, when you compare this to other areas, it's nice and gradual and relatively consistent. And you can see how that red line, which is this season, has kind of waxed and waned as we've gone a little bit, but she's starting to catch up and roll right into where we're at. So for Kentville, according to Farm West, we're sitting about 316, which we should be seeing dandelions out and open in progression. We should start to see some other flowers out in the gardens and starting to see other things. The daffodils should have been out for a while, maybe starting to go the other way a little bit. So I have really noticed that it's really important to start looking at things around you, because you can really start equating them to other areas. And you start to look at other areas, and my Ohio State spelling shows historical instead of historical. I apologize for that. But you can see we're a little bit cooler there compared to where we were on the Kentville side. Then when you start to go to Halifax, we're at 258, we're even cooler. But when you looked at that other map, like 3 or 4 maps ago, you can see there was that cold spot right here. You can see in the area right here, we're warm here, we're warm here, and then all of a sudden we start to dip. And that's showing in the same thing here around Halifax. You can see how the degree days are a little further back than where Kentville would be. So I think that's always interesting to know. We get up to Charlottetown, obviously a little lower than that, a little bit further behind that. And then when you go to, did I have Summerside in there? No, I guess I didn't. I did before, but I don't know what happened to it. So here's comparing Summerside, Charlottetown, Halifax, Kentville, and Jim Kajuk, I think it's called. And you compare the different areas, and I'm looking at showing the growing degree day. So then it gives you a little more of an idea to where we at for that growing degree day spread. I did not add St. John's in here because I could have, but I didn't add it in, and obviously that's going to be a lot lower than where we're at. So I hit on it a couple seconds ago, but when you look at Ireland, everybody talks about Ireland making the best grass in the world and the best place to make digestible forages and pasture. And when you look at on the map, we're far away from them, yes. But when you look on latitude, longitude, we're not that far. And when you look at temperatures, we aren't that far off either. And I'm in the middle of doing some cool research that's looking at the degree days and also looking at the quality of Ireland's grasses and rye silage versus what we're making, and finding that we're really close to what they're doing. We just have to tweak a little bit what we're doing to mimic that. So I think there's some advantages to kind of looking at that. I've shown this before, and actually I think this was from Mike Hutchins. He shared this with me, and you're looking at legume haylage, and you're looking at the digestibility. The percent of samples is off to the left, but we're looking at digestibility, and you can see on the digestibility here that we are, that hump is really short, and there's, it goes up pretty nice because there's a lot of percent of samples here, but you can see how short that hump really is. Then you start to go over and start looking at corn silage. You've got that even more narrow hump on digestibility, but it is higher, obviously, than alfalfa. Then you go to BMR corn silage, the same shape to that, but it's going to be higher, and you're going to have more digestibility. And you can see alfalfa is still back here down there. Then when you start looking at grasses and cereal grains, see how much different and how much flatter those curves are compared to these right here. And that just shows how dynamic grasses and cereal grains or small grain silages are going to be. And that's why there's some huge advantages down here when we start to look at that. Skip over that. And we all know that we're always battling the game of physical fill versus fuel. We want to balance that. We want to control the rate of passage so that the feed goes through fast enough, but also slow enough that we're able to utilize the ingredients that we have in these rations and be able to make sure that physical fill is good and gets through at the proper time, so that we can get the advantage of the physical fill, which cows need and require, and then also the nutrients that we're getting out of that. And that's part of the whole thing. NDF is a big part of that. The higher the NDF, the lower the intake. Typically, the lower the NDF, the more these girls are going to eat. And we know that from feeding some dry cow hay in a round bale outside that they'd much rather lay on than eat. We've all been there. And then we have what I call dead cow hay, is some of that really lush, beautiful, grassy hay that a dead cow would probably eat, or we're trying to save a cow by throwing that hay out to her. And there's just a huge difference in NDF between these forages. And to me, if we can control the NDF and control the digestibility of that NDF, we can start to control a lot of things. But we have to get that bucket filled up and moved out of there before we can start filling it up and moving on it again. So it's always a battle of quality versus quantity. I want to hit it down the middle and get both, but when we're on this left side with a high NDF and low digestibility and high UNDF, we're spreading a lot of manure on the field instead of utilizing it in the cow. We talk about sustainability a lot in this industry now, and we're really focusing on it, but you want to focus on sustainability and efficiency. Here's where it starts right here. It starts on the forage side of things. And then when you're over on this side, this is when you're making milk, you're making good quality components. This is where you want to be. So we talked about phenology earlier. It's the cyclical seasonal natural phenomenon and the study of how things go and how things go every single year. We do it in integrated pest management. We track for alfalfa weevil. We track different insects. We track different things as it goes. And that's what we're doing here is we're tracking phenology, but we're tracking it on the side of forage quality. Our neighbors that do a lot of veg crops and a lot of strawberries and apples and many other forages are utilizing growing degree days like crazy for timing of harvest, for timing of applications. And we should be doing the same thing on our side on forages. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about, Amber, earlier when we were talking about the bases of base 0 is 32, base 5 is 41, base 10. And you can see the subsequent crops there and the cool season grasses versus warm. I use the signs of spring all the time. I sound really weird by doing that, but I like looking at how things progress because it tells me where we're going without having to sit on my phone or sit on my computer. I have an idea how it's happening in my area. And I also have an idea how it's happening in multiple different areas. I am in, where am I? I'm in Georgia, Tennessee, Florida, and there's a rare occurrence going on right now in the Midwestern United States and the South, where the cicadas, which we all know come out of the ground every 17 years, but this is a rare year where if anybody follows me on Facebook, they probably saw it yesterday. I took a video of the deafening millions and trillions of cicadas that have popped out of the ground in this special brood. There's basically 2 broods that come out. The last time this happened was Thomas Jefferson was president 207 years ago. The last time this many, and it happened at the same time. They're part of phenology too. When the ground temperature breaks 65, these guys pop out of the ground. They climb out of their exoskeleton. We've seen their exoskeletons everywhere. They rub their wings together to flirt. They find a girl, they mate, then they die. It's a hell of a 2 weeks. But they're everywhere here. I mean, gross everywhere. They're everywhere. And this is part of that phenology and that phenological event. So that's why you start to pay more attention to these things because it tells you a lot. And this is a little bit of what probably they're doing for these 2 weeks that we're here. But anyways, Stirling keeps messing with my slide set. So, but as the phenological triggers, we can track how, and everyone tracks how all of these things happen. People have all of these numbers already. When alfalfa blooms, there's a growing degree day to that. When alfalfa buds, there's a growing degree day to that. Right now, where I live in Buffalo, New York, our apple trees have just gone by now. There are no more flowers on the apples. We're actually starting to make little tiny apples, and the apples just went, or the flowers just went away. Our lilacs, when I see lilacs actually blooming on the trees, is when I start to see grasses and alfalfa getting close to ready. Go ahead. Question? Oop. All right, I thought there was a question there. When I see the dame's rockets, these purple and pink flowers on the side of the road, those usually match right up with alfalfa harvest. And I'm not sure if you have those up there. I think you do, but I'm not 100% sure. When the blackberries start to go to flower, that's when I start seeing alfalfa really close because I noticed everybody's starting to mow alfalfa around this time. And of course, our friend the dandelions have already gone the other way. And I track the way dandelions grow because when dandelions are starting to turn the other way and when they look like this, that is about perfect time for grass to be ready. That beautiful, soft, white, fuzzy, not gone to seed, but that soft, white, fuzzy right in that area is when grass is going to be ready. And that's, if you think about it, when we let our cows out on pasture, we've got that we're going to be in that part of dandelions where we're typically going to be into here to into here. Somewhere in here is typically when we're letting them out. And when I see guys harvesting trit and rye, our dandelions have kind of gone from that upright bright yellow to starting to get to be that little more mustard color, and we're kind of starting to wilt and kind of get a little bit slumpy. And when we see that, then we know that's right about the right time. So there's a lot of things that I use to do that. This is the growing degree day chart that I've put together for years and years and years, tweaked it a little bit as it goes. I've got the dandelions, grass mixes. We've added in cereal grains, clover involved into there as well. I've got base 5, base 0, base 41, base 32 on here. But like I said, I'm usually moving everything to 0 and 32 as we go. With forage quality, I work a lot with cereal grains, and these cereal grains make great feed. If you look here, this is BMR corn silage on average from Cumberland Valley. You look at the quality over a 6-year period, it's 68. Then you look at corn silage at 58. Most all of us that have conventional corn silage know we're going to be sitting in that 55 to 60 range. Our BMRs are going to be in that 65 to 72 range normally. But look what happens when the cereal forage is made right in the spring, and sometime our sorghums that are made in the summer, but our cereal grains, when made in the spring, look where they sit. They sit right in the middle. And a lot of my good farms now, they are shooting for NDFD 30s on their triticale and rye to be at 68 to 72 BMR haylage, BMR cereal grains. So to me, that's a really important part. Then we start to go all the way down into straw. We know why we use straw at certain times. It's not really digestible, but we put a lot of hold into that diet. And then you can see right here on this part of the slide where BMR is a low UNDF, but straw is a real high. And note alfalfa, where she's sitting. Alfalfa might have a low NDF, but she's got a pretty high UNDF because of that stem. There's a lot of back end of that stem that's not digestible. And there's a lot of times on the alfalfa side when we're trying to chase quality, we try to get our NDF low and lower and lower and lower, but then our UNDF still is not dropping, but we're starting to see looser cows because we keep pushing that NDF lower and lower. And a lot of times now I see our NDF lower in alfalfa than corn silage. And that's not what we want to really rely on it for. So that's just a side note. My goals for a lot of grasses, I already talked about benchmarks, so I'm going to skip over this. We talked about this a little bit where I think it's really important to measure where the stems are at compared to coming out of boot, more so than actually looking at where the flag leaf is going to be. I've tracked enough forage to know that when I compare, this was done on 5/12. This sample was taken on 5/17. This was done in 2019. And we know for every 1% increase in UNDF 240, we're going to have 0.6 pounds, sorry, it's in pounds, 1.6 pounds less dry matter intake, 1.3 less pounds of fat corrected milk. So when I look at my numbers here, I'm going to skip over and not look at the crude protein, but I'm going to look at NDF. Remember, I said I like my NDFs on triticale or cereal grains and grasses to be between 45 and 50, maybe leak to 51. That's as far as I want her to go. And I don't want her to go under 40, really under 45, because if you look here, your NDF-OM is 41. That's fast. There's no structure there. There's not much fiber. NDFD 30, 80. BMR wants to be that. UNDF 240 is in that 4% range, which is really, really low. I don't like to really see it under 6 for the UNDF 240 as a percent of dry matter. And this was done on 5/12. Give us 5 more days. When we get 5 days later, and also look, the milk per ton is 39, around that 4,000. RFQ is 250. RFV is 160. 1 week later, 5 days later, NDF is 46. From 41 to 46, NDFD drops from a crazy 80 to 65, which is still good feed. This is really good feed still. This is what most people would say is their best feed on the farm, but we can do better than that by probably a couple days. So it's interesting to see. And then the milk per ton obviously drops down to that 3,400 from 3,900. I've done a lot of work on the nitrogen side, and I think Stirling had a couple questions about nitrogen and fertilization and what to use, how to use it, whether, and a lot of our farms in Western New York now are injecting manure in the fall. They're putting a huge whack of manure in. They're planting their triticale earlier, right after corn, and then they're putting nitrogen on later because they're trying to get it in. The earlier you get those crops in, the more tonnage you're going to get. So what a lot of guys are doing is injecting manure later, and then they're putting enough in so that it takes care of the spring and then the subsequent corn harvest in the beginning in that spring after we've planted corn. But here's some interesting stuff. I did this last year at 5.5. I know the dates are going to be way earlier than you guys, but 5.5, I did Koga, which is a hybrid rye, triticale, Koga. Again, you can see right here, that light green is where the guy had to go around posts. And if you notice up here in the corner, he was growing around electric lines. And so when he goes around that, he has a lot of skips. When you see the darker on either side, that's rye on one side, trit on the other. And we've got those spots that never see any nitrogen. So if you focus on it, it's very interesting to note that you've got this number right here. When we fed it really hard with nitrogen and ammonium sulfate, we had 23% protein for both of them. The stuff that received no nitrogen was living on its own, 11% and 13%, and we harvested this crop at 520, so another 15 days. So imagine what happens to that crude protein at that time. It's not going to sink that much more, but it would be in the single digits. The interesting part to notice about this, though, is that not only does the lack of nitrogen affect crude protein, it also inherently stresses that plant out a little because you don't have enough nitrogen. And then all of a sudden, you look at our NDFD 12, you look at our NDFD 30, you look at our UNDF 240, we're causing innate stress in that plant by not giving her enough juice. I think this is super critical. And I think so many people have made this mistake for so many years. You can think of our farm at home, how many times we probably chinched a little bit too much on the nitrogen side. And nobody typically looks at the NDF digestibility part and effects of nitrogen deficiency. So I
John,
think this is critical. Yep.
I was going to ask John, like you're applying this to triticale, but would you say that also the same logic could be used on all your other grasses and alfalfa?
Grasses and alfalfa. Yeah, I believe that's 100% correct. I think Amber, I think on triticale and rye, it's gonna, and even grasses, you're gonna see more of a benefit and more of a boom from it because there is a top end of alfalfa, and we know that what nitrogen, it fixes nitrogen as well. So I don't think you're going to see as much of a bump as you do on the side of what these grasses and cereal grains are. This comes from Tom Kilser. I just covered it up actually now that I was trying to look at it, but this is a little math program you can, or not program, a little math calculation you can do. You can take, if you know the dry matter tons per acre, you take the dry matter tons per acre, multiply it by 2,000 for us, 2,000 pounds, sorry. Then we've got 2,000 pounds. We take that and times the dry matter. And then what we do is we multiply it by the amount of crude protein that we want to have in that forage. So we take the pounds of dry matter out of that acre, multiply it times that 0.18, because I figured 18% in this equation, comes to 1440. 1440 divided by 6.25 equals 243 pounds of nitrogen. So if we wanted that tonnage, which would be 4 ton to the acre times 2,000 is 8,000 pounds. So 4 ton to the acre, 18% crude protein. We're going to need 243 pounds of nitrogen. And I usually split that in half, not half applications. Sometimes some people do, but I'm saying half nitrogen, half ammonium sulfate, because we want to make sure we're getting that 10-to-1 ratio of sulfur to nitrogen to get that protein boost. But I have guys where I'm at right now that are planting triticale and rye in last week of August, first week of September. When they're harvesting, the stuff is up to my chest. They're getting 8 to 10 tons to the acre, and we're finally figuring it out on these herds. They're up to that 400 pounds of nitrogen, and they're getting that high crude protein. Before, when they were just using your 200 to 250 pounds of nitrogen, they would get good tonnage, but then they would have that low protein on this forage when they're harvesting it. It was high until that point. The last week, we gained so much biomass, there wasn't enough juice to go around. And then you can see in this chart that I have here as well, I track the forage every single week from one week to the next on Fridays. You can see how the crude protein goes 23, 23, 19, 18, and then boom, that last week, when she's getting close to heading out, she goes into that 14% range. And then you can see how much the UNDF increases, how much the NDF doesn't move that much, but then you see that UND or that NDF-D12 change as well. So that's why I'm focusing a lot on this stuff, looking at samples week to week to week to week, so that we can maximize that. This is just comparison of alfalfa to triticale. I'm not going to focus on this that much. We all know that alfalfa is going to give us protein, higher protein than on average on these cereal grains and grasses. We know you're going to be lower in NDF on alfalfa. You're going to be higher in NDF. That's why you've got to make that grass and the cereal grains right when you need to make them, and even maybe on a touch on the earlier side, so you can benefit from that excess digestibility that we're going to get from that we won't get from alfalfa. This is comparing some forage from one year to the next. One of my farms that I work with, same field, same forages, almost the same time. 5.9 of 2023 are in the blue. 5.5 of 24 are in the yellow. Look at the ADF. 25, 25, 26. NDFOM 40, 44. That was a little high on a triticale we had, but 40, 42. NDFD 12, 70, 63, 66, 68. NDFD 30, 72, 72, 70, 72. And you look at the UNDFs. See how consistent? When you've got it figured out and you're working with Mother Nature and you're working as a team approach, you can do this consistently year to year to year to year, as long as you're on top of it and proactive about it. And so it's not an accident. Any questions along the way? Sterling, any questions? Amber, any questions?
No, you're good so far.
How are we doing on time? Sterling don't want to say anything. He's just sitting there looking pretty.
No, we're good on time, John. You keep going.
Okay, good. Any thoughts on what I've gone through so far on the haylage side or the triticale side, or basically the grass silage conversation, and what you see?
Well, John, what I was going to say is I think this is actually like excellent timing on this talk, in that for most of the producers, what we should be doing now is going to look at like your average first cut samples, and then just see what your UNDF is and see how we can improve. There was a question in here from Dylan. He was asking about BMR corn silage. He grows BMR corn silage, low lignin alfalfa. And some of these farms that are doing that, they have to supplement with some straw. So what is your recommendation to try? Is there a way to avoid that?
Well, my first question to Dylan would be, how many acres does he have? Because it becomes a point where we've got BMR, we've got low lignin alfalfa, we've got a higher plane of digestibility, a higher inherent rate of passage. And then I like to put a little bit of straw in myself because I like that ballast or that governor in there. Because you don't have to put a lot of straw in to make a difference, to give you some of that hold, to give you that, oh, this is going to get me all worked up, that creamy, nice, creamy, consistent manure that we see, as opposed to loose, firm, loose, firm, loose, firm, and bubbly, where I see a lot of those herds that are BMR, really great BMR, and pushing the limit on low lignin alfalfa, and they're trying to keep ahead of it, but it's a runaway train. That's why I like to throw a tick of straw in. I like to throw just a little bit of straw in and see how that manure changes, and then see what happens. And it usually doesn't take much, but we're going to get a little bit of hold there and a little bit of slowdown. A lot of the herds that I work with that are on that path have tried to use less straw and just increase the amount of forage they have. That's definitely an option. The problem is then we start running out of forage, because as we make better forage, the cows eat better. The more
I think he's on.
Go ahead.
Hey, John. Thanks.
Dylan's right there.
Thanks,
Okay.
Amber, for taking that question there.
Hey, Dylan, what's up?
Just another day, man. Thanks for doing this.
No problem.
So yeah, full disclosure, we don't feed BMR, but just from a concept of,
sure,
when we look at all the different costs in our ration, straw, where we are, straw is 12 cents a pound if you want to buy wheat straw. And it's actually a high priced feed in our ration. So that's why I'm wondering, what can we do with our forages so that, we can still find that line of really, really good quality, but not have to add in things like an expensive ingredient like straw.
Yeah, and that's why I know I will sound really unpopular for saying this, but that's why I'm not saying I prefer alfalfa or grasses by any means, but that's sometimes the advantage in these diets that we have with grass, is because you're going to inherently have a little more NDF in your grasses, and you're going to have a lower, it's a hard thing to kind of figure without looking at it, but you're going to have a little bit higher NDF in your grasses or cereal grains, or your grass cereal mixes, or your grass alfalfa mix. You're going to have a little higher NDF, but you're going to have a lower UNDF on that back end side. With alfalfa, you're going to have a lower NDF, but a higher UNDF, a higher undigestible portion. I think sometimes on the alfalfa side, we get ourselves caught in a corner because we keep trying to make better alfalfa, and then we go to low lignin alfalfa, and then we try to make the low lignin alfalfa a little earlier, and then we start to get into trouble where we're starting to get loose manure tweaking back and forth, even with conventional corn silage. We'll start to see that. We'll get to a point, especially if we're using snaplage or not snaplage, if we're using high moisture corn, we're going to get to that point. So to me, I think putting a little bit of grasses into those mixes, or maybe sometimes going a little bit more on the grass, or putting some cereal grains in to kind of supplement, and at 20-30% of that diet, sometimes we can look at those things and be able to wiggle through without having straw in the diet. There are plenty of herds out there that are feeding conventional corn silage with low lignin and not needing straw. But the BMR part does make it a little bit faster. And you'd have to look at the diet. Every ration's different. So there's obviously things you'd have to look at to better answer it. And we can always talk more about it, and look at your individual situation and probably be able to help you out that way too. But it's a great
John,
question.
I have two more questions.
Yep.
One, just a comparison on tonnage you get with the alfalfa versus grass versus the cereal grasses.
Yep.
Could you comment on?
Yeah, it depends on the amount. It depends on the weather. There are guys in Pennsylvania and Maryland, in that area there, where they're giving up on alfalfa because they've had issues with dry summers, and they're just chasing it around, cutting to cutting to cutting, and they're not getting as much. Now, granted, I know grasses can be pretty shy to that as well, but my guys in Western New York, there are a few guys that actually are just doing all corn silage and triticale. They're digging up and tearing up their alfalfa, which I'm not
Okay.
saying that everyone should do, but it makes an interesting situation. And that's when I think we should start maybe looking at combinations of forage a little bit, depending on the farm, depending on the acreage. But they're doing it from a standpoint of they're getting more tons of dry matter in that 1 to 2 week period than they were for all 5 cuttings for them. 5
So
cuttings.
this kind of leads into the other question that someone else had regarding the triticale and like the time of planting. So those guys that are doing just the corn silage and triticale, when are they planting their grass, or like when are they planting and harvesting the triticale?
So that's another part of that question that's great, because some of these guys, they're kind of outsmarting the system. Where we live in the Maritimes, okay, I already live in the Maritimes, it sounds like, but where you live in the Maritime, maybe I should live in the Maritimes, but when you're looking at the Maritimes, we all know that it's going to be later to harvest corn silage than where I live in Western New York, or where I live further down into the States. We have the opportunity to plant that triticale or rye a little earlier because we're getting that out of the field earlier as well. But I feel that there are exceptions. These guys that are doing triticale and no alfalfa anymore and corn silage, they're planting it in the ground on wheat straw ground. So they're harvesting wheat straw in August. They're planting that triticale or rye September 1st, the last week of August. So they're giving a really long growing season. It tillers like crazy, and basically going into the winter, it's like 12 inches tall going into the winter. And then that's where they get this massive amount of feed, where they don't get that when they follow corn. And that's the real tricky part of this as we travel further north and farm further north, is it's really hard to follow that. So then there's ways you've got to cheat around it. If you're doing wheat or doing wheat straw, you have an opportunity, instead of letting that field stay empty for the fall part, you have the ability to put it in there. If you've got some fields that you're going to turn over for next spring, say you've got a tired alfalfa stand or a tired grass stand or some sort of tired stand that you're going to want to plant again in the next season, or you're going to tear up and plant. I have a lot of guys that successfully put rye or trit in the fall. They plant it and then they harvest it off in the spring, and then they decide what they're going to do with that crop, whether they tear it up and plant, reseed it again, or what they do. So guys are starting to find ways and find excuses to plant it early, because the whole key to rye and triticale is you've got to feed it and you've got to put it in early. And every area you go to, I have a map that shows what the cutoff date is from having a pretty winter forage that looks like a nice little carpet to stuff that you can actually mow. And there's a difference. And that's why the hard part of the Maritimes is the dates that we try to chop. It's hard to follow that. And that's why most of my guys now in the northern climates in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, northern New York, we're shortening our day length on corn. Mm-hmm. We're making these things work together because we find that we're actually increasing our ton. If we shorten our day length by corn by say 100, 150 CHUs, or in the US, maybe by 8 to 10 days of relative maturity, we know we're going to lose that 1 to 2 ton to the acre, maybe. And there's a caveat there. We know we're going to lose a little bit of corn maybe by backing it down, but we gain 4 to 6 to 8 ton of triticale or rye in the spring. So it actually, the benefits really are better. And think about this. This is great. So, and this is a question for you. Does corn silage like fall?
Well, not the hurricanes.
Well, and yeah, that's true. Yeah. So we do have a little bit of, but what I'm saying is
until mid-September.
Yeah. If we plant a long CHU corn, if we outkick our coverage on CHUs for corn, we know what happens. The temperature's going this way, right? Daylight is going this way. we've got this super long day corn that's way longer than our ground is supposed to have. And it's not like she's going to get better. We're going to get, it's going to slow down because the day length starts to get too short. The corn doesn't dry down as fast. We aren't accumulating starch anymore. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to make something work that's on its way down already by going longer. I would say if we shorten the day length on corn, typically that corn is going to finish earlier. We're going to get a little bit more starch. And there's a rumor that starch makes corn silage tonnage better, right? If we got an ear, that's a good thing. So by shortening our day length, we're accumulating a little more starch. So, and I'm not saying shorten it by 250 CHUs. I'm just talking about little baby steps. You shorten it up, you end up getting more starch. And a lot of times I get guys that shorten their corn up and they fight and kick and scream about doing that. And then 2 years after they did it, they're like, we got more tonnage than we did before. How does that happen? And I'm like, well, we're right sizing our corn for our ground.
Yep.
And maybe you tick less. Then we shorten it up. We can fit the triticale or rye into that equation, take advantage of that. And I will say one thing. Everybody talks about global warming. You might talk about global, I don't know, do you?
A little bit.
Sometimes, right. So we talk about
I like the sunny
warming.
days.
Yeah, but what we do know, and we can all agree on, even in the Maritimes, we're having longer falls, right? Typically.
Yep.
Indian summers, we'll call them. So we got these longer falls. What is going to grow better in a moderate fall? Corn silage or triticale that loves cool, moderate weather? You throw her into the ground and she just says, yeah, this is what I want. This is my wheelhouse. So we're putting that crop in its wheelhouse and we're getting all this digestibility because grasses, cereal grains like cool and moderate temperature. We get that in the fall. It goes dormant. We get it in the spring. All of a sudden, we have that cool, moderate temperature, and we're getting all this boom, great digestibility. But when we're in the corn silage phase, we're trying to go grow longer day corn, and she's fighting and kicking and screaming because she doesn't have the day length. She doesn't have the daylight. She won't dry down. She's not going to finish in complete starch until she gets frosted. And then she says, yeah, I'm done. And when that happens, you're not going to get anything anyways. So to me, you hit a hot button there. But that it's a really important hot button because I don't think many of us quite think it through as well as we should.
No, I agree. And then I have a list of things that I want from you after regarding your link and that. And I'm going to add on. So we don't have the like the days, your optimal days that you would put in for the Maritimes. If you have that chart or that information, we'll get that after.
Yep, I do. Yep, yeah, and I do have that, and I can look at that and show that. And actually, it's you can see the chopper on the cover here as I move and progress into corn silage. That's kind of a great thing. Can I have some water, by the way? I'm just kidding. I'm sitting in a hotel abandoned office, so I don't think I'm gonna probably die of lack of water here before too long because I think they're trying to heat me out of here. But when I look at it, I should have put a Stanley Cup. Stirling probably wants to beat me over the head here. He'd rather have a a green jacket. He'd probably want to put a green jacket there. So when you look at it, we can't control the weather, but we can work with the weather. And I think that was part of the previous conversation here. But we can control our day length, our CHUs. We can control the planting population. We can control dry matter at harvest. We can control the processing score. We can control how well we pack it. We can control the variety. I know I saw some really nice examples of pretty good packing density up there when I was up there the last couple times, actually. And I've seen some ones that could have been a little bit better too. But we talked about that and we know why certain things happen. But with corn, this is kind of where it's at. That's a really big part. So what I like to do is if I can control these two things, and I should have probably done another hockey reference, but don't outkick your coverage on CHUs or relative maturity. and don't outkick your coverage on planting population for that individual variety. If you've got a fixed variety, you can crowd her all day long. And she's like, all right, I'm going to throw the same ear out. If we have a flexier variety, more of like your silage varieties or the flowery varieties, if we have a variety of corn that has a preference of being more flexy, think of BMR, those crops don't want to be crowded. If we crowd a BMR, I can go in and I can ruin a BMR crop. You plant too long, you plant too much population, you don't feed it, and you put it on tough ground. I can ruin a crop pretty easy. And I think I have at times before, unfortunately, years ago, before I knew how to feed BMR and plant BMR. But if you give BMR room to breathe and room to grow, you're going to get that flex on the ear and you're going to get that flex on stalk. We all know we can walk through a field, and I know I've talked about this before, but we can walk through a field, and when we see a skip on either side of a corn plant on BMR that's overcrowded, you look at it and you see, wow, you've got this really nice sized stalk to it, and the ear is like really big, and there's a lot, and it's a lot round, and you look at it and you're like, wow, I wish the whole field was like this. And then you look at the rest of the field that's crowded a little bit, and you've got these dinky, tiny stalks, ears are small, and that's the big thing is to me, the relative maturity is important. The CHUs are important, but to me, the planting population per variety is really important. Because if you look at different bags of seed corn, they used to put the bag number or the bag population on the seed corn bags, 32 to 36, 28 to 32, 26 to 30. The lower the range of CHU, the lower the range of population, means the flexier that variety is. You go to the top end of that variety that's flexy and you put it on tough ground, it's your fault. It's probably not your fault. It's probably everyone's fault. And everybody's so optimistic in the dairy industry. Some people. We're so optimistic in the dairy industry where we say, okay, where should I plant the day length on this corn? And say it's a flexi variety that's, say, 30 to 34. You and the seed person are going to look across the street and you're going to see your best ground and you're going to say, oh, that field can handle 34. So we just plant 34 everywhere. And that doesn't work because there are those fields that are a few miles down the road or the field behind the woods that never gets enough fertilization. The ground is tougher. So we just crowd the hell out of the corn. And she's like, yeah, what do you want me to do here? And that's what typically happens. So I like variable populations, but I would much rather on a flexi variety go on the lower side than really push on the higher side, because oftentimes on BMRs, I see guys, my whole BMR thing is this, I go into a farm, they're saying, I don't know if I'm gonna ever plant BMR again. We don't like get the tonnage. It's a little shorter than our conventional. The ears, it's a stressy plant. She's just so hard to take care of. And nobody likes the high maintenance ones, right? So that's what happens. But when you lower the population, you take the stress off that plant, then after 2 years of drop in population from 34 to 32 to 30, and it takes a little faith. And I understand why people wouldn't want to drop population that much, but we take baby steps. Then all of a sudden we're down to 28 or 30 on certain varieties of BMR, and we're down at 28 and we're getting more tonnage. We're getting a healthier plant. We're getting higher starch levels, and we still got the digestibility. So there's so much to this part of it that I think people don't quite give it credit for. But this corn zone map is blinding. I can share it. I pulled it out of somewhere. But I would say this map is a good old school map. But what I'm going to do is if I work with your farm, I'm going to go and I'm going to find a weather station, I'm going to look at 15 years of data, or preferably use the weather station on your farm if you have one. And I'm going to ask you 2 questions that are actually 4 questions. When do you want to plant? When do you actually plant? When do you chop? And when do you really chop? Or when do you want to chop and when do you really chop? There are 4 questions that are actually 2, but there's a little bit of wiggle in both. So what I like to do is, instead of using an old school map like this, which gets you close, but there are times when I'm looking at degree days from May 1st or May 15th to September 20th, and I track it for that farm, and I look at the map and it tells me what it's supposed to be. I'm like, yeah, we're like 200 lower than what that map says. And they're like, well, that's what the map says. And I'm like, okay, but the actual ground and the season is telling you something different. Go with what 15 years of data tells you. Don't go with what a map tells you. The map might be 15 years old, but that doesn't mean it's accurate. So that's kind of my answer to that part a little bit. A lot of guys up there in the Maritimes, we're using about only one BMR, which is the 90-day BMR. I've had a long-term relationship with her. We've had great dates and we've had horrible dates. And she's been good to me and she's been not good to me. There are farms where it's been outstanding. We keep the population down. There are certain farms it works like a champ, and there are other farms that probably maybe stretch the limits and it just doesn't quite work. But this is actually from Brabant, and this is US, so sorry, but it's northern New York, Maine, northern Vermont, and New Hampshire. So she's kind of in your area, the same latitude, longitude. So this is all of their Brabant 90-day plots, I think, thrown together. So you're looking at, they harvested at 35 dry matter. Great. They hit it right when they needed to. NDF is where it needs to be because of the starch level. NDF D12 is at 41 to 45 range, which gets me all worked up because it's great. When you look at the NDF 12 on a conventional variety, she's going to sit 33 to 38. She's going to sit right tight in that area, when the BMR is going to be up top at that 41 to 45, looking down at it, whether you have a dry season or a wet season. That seems to not change. On this 90-day BMR, you have to protect yourself on starch. The 90-day Brabant BMR, she is not starchy. If we crowd her, she's going to tell us we crowded her. And if you look, I would suggest that a lot of these people that have used this variety might have a tendency to crowd her, because she's 27 starch and she's 35 dry matter. When I see 35 dry matter and 27 starch, 2 things come to my mind: frost, or we outkicked our coverage on population, or outkicked our coverage on relative maturity, which we know 90 years, and you're at 90 already. So, but look at the NDFD 30, this BMR 90-day, no matter where you're at, whether you're in Ontario, whether you're in, I don't see it much in Quebec, in Nova Scotia, in any of my places in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Vermont, Maine. It's really used a lot in Maine. One thing she plants, she will stamp digestibility. She can do one thing really, really good. And that's one thing I like about her. She has that digestibility and she's really consistent with that digestibility. So that's one thing. So then we go, okay, if we lower planting population, are we going to increase our starch a little bit? Because I know we're trapped. And I don't mean trapped in a bad way. We're just trapped on our day length and the BMRs that we have as an option. So we're always looking for something new. And that was, I know, some of the questions that we were asked about something new as well. So,
well, I think on that one too, when we talk to our producers, we say the most important thing, because it's not going to be a high starch product. As you said, you're chasing digestibility, then you have to hedge your bet and make sure that your commodities or your energy source is booked.
Correct. But I 100% agree with that. Sounds like I was getting ready to disagree, which I don't at all. Buying digestible fiber, that's a hard price to put on something. You can't buy you used to be able to, because I fed a ton of brew herds for years and made whack loads of milk on brew. And I fed really low forage diets, made good components, great milk, utilizing digestible fiber. Soy hulls, I made a career. I was like the soy hull king back about 20 years ago when the soy hull prices were super cheap. I would feed 6 to 8 pounds of soy hulls and fluctuate it throughout the year, depending on forage quality and whether corn silage was fresh or fermented. And man, I could make a ton of milk working that digestible fiber, but that's not as easy anymore because commodities aren't nearly as cheap. And it is hard to chase digestible fiber. It's a little easier to chase starch, maybe a lot easier to chase starch. But like you said, there is a point where you don't want to have to buy super expensive corn and try to chase it. So I will say up front, don't chase digestibility on corn silage, because for the most part on conventional corn, she's in a little window. You're going to get those rare situations where you got one field that might be 65 NDFD 30 on a conventional variety, and you're going to go, whoa, that stuff, why? And you can't figure it out, and don't try, because you can't copy it, because the rest of your fields are slumped in that 58 to 60 range. Any other one that's 65. Maybe a high chopped it. I don't know what happened, but that's the one that the seed guy brings around and shows everybody, whoa, look at this variety. She's 65 everywhere you go. And it probably happened in one field. So don't chase digestibility. Chase a variety that grows well on your farm, that isn't stressy on your farm. Hit the right dry matter at harvest. Hit the right population. And then also make sure you hit the right CHUs and daily. The digestibility can come if you treat it right. You're not going to get a bunch, but you're going to get some more out of it. This is a chart I had, but it's not in CHUs. It's in growing degree days. It's got relative maturity across the bottom, and it has degree days to black layer up top. And I use this a lot for my corn silage guys because I can subtract out, because most bags are going to show you CHUs or degree days to black layer. I don't know about you, but I don't chop my corn silage at black layer or my corns at black layer, because that just doesn't going to work. So I always subtract off and be able to sit in the wheelhouse of where I need to be. Milk, I can't do this webinar without talking about this. Dr. Shaver and Joe Lauer from Wisconsin. Louise also was a big, huge part of this. They've created a new milk 2024. It just was released recently. It takes into account more digestibility and starch digestibility. It's brand new. Actually, this was the demo version. So that's just being released right now. It's replacing milk 2006, and a lot of the ones that we were using previously. So that's just coming out right now. I work with and I don't know, wasn't sure if I should talk much about this. I won't talk a lot about it. There's a farm in in Alberta, that does this plot every year called Cornucopia. And he does a great job with it. And I started looking at some of the numbers of this, and I saw a variety in there that I thought, whoa, where did this variety come from? Now I find out that it's not able to be sold in Eastern Canada. It can only be sold in Western Canada. So really, there's no sense to talk about it because it's not available to us. But I saw it in 2 or 3 plots, and it seemed to be really high in digestibility. So I tried to get more information on it. I talked to the seed company, and I didn't get anything out of it, unfortunately. So that's still something we're going to chase. But we do know that many people say variety is king. To me, weather trumps variety almost every day. you're going to have a certain amount of flex between varieties, but weather just will make you honest pretty quick. They're not all like this corn, this flowery leaf or this leafy corn that was grown here in northern, right on the border of Canada. But so let me skip over a lot of this stuff. And then digestibility is set typically from when the plant pops out of the ground to when she tassels. The growing season that she has between emergence and tassel is really will dictate how your digestibility is on your corn silage for that season. BMR will still do BMR things. Conventional will still do conventional things, but you notice if you have a hot or a wet season, no matter if it's hot or cold, that wet stress is going to impact that crop a lot more. Because if you look at the different digestibilities of conventional corn silage, we're sitting 60, 59, 61, 60, 61, whatever. But then we get cool and wet, and then we get wet. Wet being the key. When we get to here, that's when you want to kill digestibility. If we get a nice, hard, rainy June, we're going to cross-link that forage and we're going to get a lot of growth, but we're going to get less digestibility. So if you want to kill digestibility, you do that. How are we on time, by the way? I have no idea.
We're doing pretty good. I think we're running to the end of the fourth quarter there, John.
No problem. I'm going to skip over a lot of this stuff for next time or some other time. I think this is interesting. CHUs right here. Harvest dry matter right here. So orange line is dry matter. Low dry matter down here. High dry matter up here. This isn't rocket science, but we don't ever look at it enough. So in Alberta, if we try to plant a 25 or 2600 CHU corn, she don't like it. And we can't ever get it to dry, and we don't get starch out of it because of that. So I think that's really an important part of that puzzle. Moisture, sugar, bacteria, all of these are important, and now we're moving on to fermentation. So we need moisture, we need sugar, we need bacteria, and we definitely need some acids when we're doing that, and that's basic fermentation. When we look at fermentation, harvest dry matter is critical. We cover that bunk, we reduce the pH, we increase the lactic acid, we reduce the oxygen out first, we get stability. Basically, we're vacuum sealing that forage. And then also we want it to be preserved and not change. So we want to keep that preservation like you have it. So she's frozen in time, right? So we can wake her up later. One thing I love about this is a corn silage trial that was done with an inoculant in Western New York. It's an inoculant that I helped make that I was kind of behind a little bit, but it isn't that the inoculant is the story. The story is here. This is proper fermentation. The blue line is fresh. You can see the pH is 5.5 to 6. That's what fresh forage is. You ain't going to change that. But 7 days later, corn silage is down to 4.1. She's going the right way. At 90 days, she's down to 3.7. And Amber, I think you would take 3.7, 3.8 pH on corn silage every day of the week, right? She does what she's supposed to do. Look at lactic acid. There's nothing at harvest because it's on the plant. We still have oxygen. But look, 7 days, boom, she comes up. 90 days, she's way up. And we start to see that. We're going to see acetic acid rise in our corn, in any forage actually that we're going to have. But I think this shows what proper, oops, I went ahead. We're going to show what proper fermentation does. And then it even goes on to haylage. I added sugar here onto, this was alfalfa haylage. We have our sugar at harvest was 12%. 3 days in, she was still around 12%. So she was sitting doing nothing. Then at 7 days, boom. Sugar drops because we're starting to do other things. You'll see the pH sitting still here at 5.5 to 6. Oxygen's taken out. She starts to ferment. Right away, the pH drops, pH drops, pH drops, pH drops from 0 to 90 days. But it's even better to focus on basically 7 days and 14. Stuff happens right in here. It's the aerobic, anaerobic phase that we're seeing in corn silage and haylage. You see this a lot in that same area. So this is just showing what proper fermentation does. We get some VFA profiles. We see a little bit of acetic. We see that lactic go up a little bit, but we definitely see that range, and we see the utilization and the proper utilization of sugars, because this is alfalfa haylage. We didn't burn all the sugar up. We still got a little sugar to hang out with. That is proper. And this is using an inoculant. No one knows sometimes if we're using inoculant, if it benefits us and we have the return on investment. But looking at enough forages and fermentations, this is my new friend, my new passion on the fermentation side. I look at tons of forage, and when we're using an inoculant in a haylage, grass silage crop, that needs to be used all the time. We have media, we have corn silage, we have starch, we have sugar, and we have media to ferment corn silage. I still like an inoculant on corn silage because we're not all going to make it at 35 dry matter. All the bacteria on the forage aren't going to be perfect all the time, and we want to do what we can to promote and push the proper direction for fermentation. Haylage is going to start, grass silage, triticale, haylage, alfalfa, silage, all of that starts at a little bit of a disadvantage on fermentation. So that's why we need to use inoculant on those crops all the time. And we talk about this. I'm going to skip over this because of time. Your typical fermentation, we're getting the oxygen out. We're starting to have that increase in lactic acid. The oxygen's gone. The sugar starts to reduce. The pH starts to drop. Acetic acid will come up a little bit. I think some acetic acid is good. Too much is too much. Butyric acid we're going to get to here in a second. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. I'm going to look at this a little bit. So we have front-end bacteria. We have the homolactic, homofermentative front-end inoculants. Think of Lactobacillus plantarum, Pediococcus pennisaceus being the two major ones that we see in the industry, trying to get fermentation to happen very fast. Lactic acid production, pH drops really, really rapidly. Pretty simple. You have some other bacteria that'll be in there for different reasons. There's the Lactococcus lactis that a lot of people should be using for wet forages, and potential for reduction of Clostridia and butyric acid production. There's certain bacteria that I really like that seem to be able to inhibit some of that butyric acid production. There's the heterofermentative, the back end for the heterolactic. The Buchneri is the main one we hear about, Buchneri brevis, Hilgardiae, delavorans. Those do a great job. They do a great job for what they're supposed to be for. If you've got a high moisture corn that's in a big bunk or a real big silo, or she's a little bit on the drier side, I love using double Buchneri on my snaplage, high moisture corn, drier corn silage with a really big bunk that we can't keep ahead of every day. We're not getting that 12 inches off a day. I like to utilize that Buchneri for that. Where I don't like to see Buchneri used is when we harvest haylage on the wet side and we say, okay, well, I've got some already. I've got a combination inoculant, or I've got some Buchneri left over. I'm going to throw it on to use it up. And we know that if you make wet haylage, whether it's alfalfa or grass or cereal grains, wet haylage ferments slow. There's a certain pile or a certain amount of bacteria on all forages. Every season, every cutting can be a little different, but it'll be inherently the same. But what we're doing by letting that forage wilt is we're getting the water out of it and letting that that natural bacteria do its job. If we have too much moisture and too much harvest moisture at harvest, what we're going to do is we're going to dilute the natural bacteria down. That's why I always tell people to double the inoculant, the front end inoculant, because we know that's already wet, it's diluted. What I don't like to see is when we put a Buchneri into a wet forage, because wet forages ferment slower and create more acetic acid. When we create more acetic acid, it's usually due to slow fermentation or utilizing a Buchneri, because you always see higher Buchneri on corn silages, because that's what Buchneri does. You're getting that 1,2 propanediol production, getting a higher acetic acid. The worst thing you want to do is have a forage that has a tendency to make acetic acid, and we put in an inoculant that makes acetic acid. Not the right way to go, in my opinion. And I see enough forage where I think that's pretty true. To me,
John,
I think
before
that's
we leave
really
there,
important. Yep.
could you qualify what you consider a wet forage and your target dry matter?
So alfalfa under 34, 35, 30 in that range, she can get away from you really, really quick. Alfalfa is a tricky beast because she is high in calcium, which has a buffering capacity, which doesn't like fermentation. Usually it has a higher ash level to it, doesn't like fermentation. She is going to kick and fight and scream like my 10-year-old daughter would for anything. By trying to get that forage to ferment, it's going to say, I don't want to ferment. And it needs pushed in that direction, like my daughter needs pushed in the direction. Sometimes she needs a little explaining. Same thing with this. I always want to make sure that my alfalfa haylage is not harvested too wet or too dry. There's such a thing as metabolic water. That's a fancy term for water. We need water to activate the bacteria. So if she's on the dry side, we're going to be in trouble. And if we're on the wet side, we're going to be in trouble. Grasses, cereal grains can get away with being a little wetter, but all bets are off if you're under 21, 22, 23 dry matter. All bets are off. I see guys triple their inoculant on a crop they got to get in that's a cereal grain or a triticale that's made really early, and or a grass that's made like at the perfect time, harvest window wise, but it's on the wet side and they got to get it in, and they harvest it at 25, 26, put a good amount of inoculant on it, and she surprisingly ferments just great. You wouldn't think she would. She's going to have a little higher acetic, but no butyric. I rarely see a grass or a cereal grain go butyric on me. I will see a lot of alfalfas or alfalfa mixes go butyric on me if that moisture is lower than it needs to be. And we're going to start talking about butyric because I know there were a lot of questions about butyric. Another thing you can do to ruin a good fermentation is have alfalfa that we chop a little too low or chop in the mud, and then also have manure on the field. When we have that enterobacteria on the crop, there is anti-fermentation properties there. We get a slow fermentation where lactic acid doesn't take over and say, hey, I'm pushing you in the right direction. And we let that lactic acid lag. And you can look on your forage sample and know things went way wrong when your lactic acid is under 1%. When I see lactic acid under 1%, the pH is 5.5%, 5%. Oftentimes the ash is high, the acetic is going to be high, and that's when we start getting 2% of butyric. A lot of times I see that when we're trying to push the manure window on these crops a little bit too tight to where we should be, especially on that first cutting, because that we're inoculating that bacteria, or we're creating a microbiome that is not conducive to fermentation. Not to mention the listeria and the other Clostridia issues that go along with butyric. But I will say that that's one thing, because normally the old school rule is you get a butyric forage, you lay it out and let it breathe, right? That's kind of the old school rule. The problem is if we make a wet forage that's a wet alfalfa haylage and the acetic acid level is really high, like 3%, the key to acetic acid is it's a horrible acid, but a great preservative. She's going to make things stay how they are. That's why we like using bucheneri for corn silage, because we want it to be a preservative. But what happens is when we make wet forage, it's slower because there's so much water there. It slows the fermentation. We increase the natural acetic. Then it goes butyric on us, and we have this nice solid wall of acetic acid saying, yeah, I'm not going to do a thing. You can try to stretch me out all you want, but I'm going to sit here and just look at you. And that's what happens when we make these wet forages on that side of things. I'm going to skip over a lot of this stuff, all that good stuff I'm skipping over, but that's okay. We can talk about it some other day. So that's, when you look at this slide, I think I showed this slide before, but you look at the harvest dry matter here, you look at alfalfa, grass, corn silage, you can see that alfalfa really doesn't start to ferment on its own until we're at 35 dry matter, because the average sugar level in alfalfa is going to be 5 to 15%, say 12%, 10 to 12%. If we make alfalfa at 20 to 25%, we need 21, and you see here, we need 21 and 25% sugar in that alfalfa for it to ferment. Not gonna happen. Not gonna happen.
I think before you leave this,
yep,
I was just going to say, before you leave this slide, John, something that a lot of guys are doing, because straw is becoming more difficult to get, that we're doing like a mature grass for our dry cows and heifers. And the comments are like, it's really hard to get a good fermentation on that. And you could see why, because it's pretty much dry standing and there's no sugar in it.
You need, and that's the problem. You let a forage mature, right? We know there's less sugar, there's less soluble fiber, there's always some soluble fiber, there's some parts of that sugar that is used a little bit for fermentation. But when we make a really late crop, and we also have a tendency maybe to make it a little on the drier side, it's already going to fight fermentation anyways. And these dry cow heifer forages are going to have trouble fermenting. The key to that, you're going to make a high NDF forage, correct? One thing, shorten the stuff up. There's no reason to have long stem hay on a woody forage. There's no reason to have a woody forage and then cut it long. Help fermentation by cutting it short. Help digestibility of the forage with the cow. Help the PEF by shortening the length on that undigestible forage. There's plenty of information on PEU NDF, on the physical effective fiber, the PEF length versus the UNDF. If you have a high UNDF, a woody forage, you want to go short.
Yeah.
And if you make even the same, forage, you want to go short. Go ahead.
Yeah. And even the same, like last year, and especially in Nova Scotia, we had periods of copious amounts of rain that delayed some harvesting. So then that's when you have to, look at your practices and say like, okay, maybe we do have to reduce our chop length to have a better fermentation.
And then there's other times when we make really wet feed, I want her to be longer.
Yeah.
And we can't harvest it. We know we're stuck, right? And it's going to be wet feed. My suggestions always are, when I get a phone call, which I just got about that, they said, we got wet feed, it's going to rain, it isn't drying down, I don't know what to do, I'm going to get it in, I'm going to go anyways. I'm like, double or triple the inoculant, length of cut, you want her to be longer because it was really good feed anyways, but you want it long because you have less ends.
Yep.
It's going to pack better because the more ends you have, the more water you're going to have. So increase that length of cut. On the dry side, decrease that length of cut. It's pretty simple. to see that. I'd like to spend time on this, but I know we don't have time. But this shows an alfalfa silage in research that went clostridial on it. Was 47 dry matter at harvest, kind of what we had kind of talked about in a couple different scenarios. But this scenario is basically here. This is a control. There's no inoculant on it. We're letting the natural bacteria do their thing. You don't have to know the numbers. You don't have to know these bacteria. Just know the colors. The control at 0, 7, 14, 28, and 56 days post harvest, you can see these, the yellow and the green, Enterococcus, Enterobacter. Maybe they spread manure on this field, who knows? But the red down here is lactobacillus, not much lactobacillus growth. We use an inoculant, which is Lactobacillus plantarum. See this red difference between here and here? The yellow and green here, the yellow and green here, less. That's a big deal because we were pushing the fermentation the right way and not letting butyric happen. We were pushing it in the right direction and efficiently utilizing the sugar that we had. This third one is just sugar or sucrose alone. We just gave her more sugar and she said, thank you. We mixed them both together, Lactobacillus plantarum and sucrose, and we pushed her in the right direction, even though there were a lot of reasons why she shouldn't have fermented. But we helped her go the right way. Here, she went butyric. And not many people pay attention to these types of situations. We're going to get over to butyric here in just a sec as we finish. I think it's super important to look at your forage samples on the fermentation side. I look at fermentation values first on my forage tests anymore, kind of close with digestibility. And I like to basically play leapfrog or jump from lily pad to lily pad because I'm looking at pH, and then that tells me a story. Then I look at sugar, that tells me a story. I look at lactic, I look at ash, I look at acetic, I look at butyric. I like to bounce around and look at these different things because it'll frame what happened during that fermentation. And to me, instead of looking at one number, I like to put a story together. It's like a puzzle, and you build that puzzle. We know that ash is not your friend. Ash has never been a friend to fermentation, to forage quality. There's so many reasons why ash is not good. We certainly don't like to increase that ash, but if we make wet forage, the green is dry matter, the orange is ash content. Look where the ash content is, look where the dry matter is. We get drier, what happens? The ash level typically goes down until we get too far the other way and we start getting dust. Then the ash level actually will rise a little bit again. But it's nowhere as close to bad as we are when we're making wet forage. And this is where we start to get that clostridial butyric effect. When you look at clostridial fermentation, it's just fermentation gone bad. It's like, yeah, it's fermentation gone bad because instead of having lactic acid take over and we're utilizing the sugars efficiently and it's fermenting like it should, what we're doing is we have a slow fermentation because of things preventing a fast fermentation. What do? We burn up sugar. So most of the time I'll see a high butyric acid forage. Doesn't necessarily have to be high in ash, but it's always going to have a super high pH. It's always going to have a low tanky lactic acid, and the sugar level is always going to be typically low to almost non-existent. When I see bad samples of butyric, what happens is we don't have sugar, we don't have lactic, we have lots of acetic normally and lots of butyric, and that's what's happening because that fermentation went wild the wrong way and it went slow. And then what we do is that's when we start seeing ketosis, loss of protein and energy utilization because the feeds burn up and are not being able to utilize the feed that we were using. We can create biogenic amines in the feed, and that's just basically the improper degradation of amino acids that's creating these amines, which are really, you want to make nasty, really rat dead animal smelling stuff. Those are typically going to be the biogenic amines. There's a difference between butyric silage and some of this really bad biogenic amine silage where it's slimy. You don't even want to touch it because it has that real nasty green, black, almost slimy, optic green at times consistency, and that stuff smells like dead animals. And that is typically from it. We know there's a certain limit on the amount of butyric acid that you want to have in that diet. And then this shows an example of that, and you can look at the averages, and you can talk to your nutritionist about doing that, and obviously you can talk to customers about that. The chart for butyric acid from Cumberland Valley, 84% of the samples are under 0.6. If I see from a lab a sample that's 0.25 butyric, but I look at the other fermentation parameters, the lactic is good, pH is good, ash is good, acetic is good, but I've got 0.4 or 0.3 butyric, I don't worry about it. Because I think there's a little bit of noise in all labs on that bottom end of things. And you know what I mean. You've probably had silage in your car before, or your truck before, or whatever you drive. And if it's butyric, it stays there for a half hour. Your truck's butyric. You might have these ones that are 0.2 to 0.4 to 0.5 butyric, and you really don't smell it. Oh, sorry, you don't really smell it. You might smell it on your hands hours and hours and hours later. That's usually 0.75 to 1.1, right in that range. But that low stuff, I don't worry about nearly as much. I'm not as critical on this side of things. I'm critical when we get here and above. That, and then this one right back here goes to what you were talking about. This is a rarity right here. Okay. We know that wet dry matter haylage, right here, you can't see that. Wet dry matter haylage right here at 26, you're going to have a high butyric. That makes sense. She's got the recipe to be high butyric. Look, 5% acetic, lactic's lower, but still okay. pH is high, sugar's on the low side, ash is still okay. But we made it really wet, slow fermentation, butyric happened because it was coming from the field. I had a herd right here where if you look at their dry matters, 36, 40, 40, 41, 37, and we were having drier feeds. Ash levels were okay, but a little on the high side, and we were seeing a little more butyric acid, and he was manuring the hell out of it every single cutting. And we always, usually if you look at a group of forages, you're going to see a low level of butyric every fourth or fifth sample. This guy had it on every single sample, and it wasn't super high, but it's just to note that these were dry silages. Normally dry haylages don't make butyric that often. You can, but not normal. So spring manure application is very risky. Clostridial typically comes from either soil contamination, manure contamination, and then we ruin the fermentation on that as well. The biogenic amines, that decarboxylation products of amino acids, basically the improper breakdown of amino acids, the loss and the decomposition, of that protein makes these biogenic amines. The popular ones are putrescine, cadaverine. None of those sound real good, right? So that's part of it. Ways to reduce harvest dry matter: above 30 for grasses, cereals, sorghums, above 35 for alfalfa, clover, basically legumes. Correct wilting. Windrow should be 80% of cutter bar width, so we can wide swap that so it can dry a little bit quicker. Manure application is discouraged on that side. I would much rather use dry nitrogen applications. Manure application should be applied as close to post-harvest as possible for later cuttings. Utilize an inoculant at 1 to 2x rate on these haylages that could be questionable. And that is it. I don't know how we are on time. I got to catch a plane.
Hey, John, that was really good. You covered everything that was asked. Amber, you were tremendous with all your inputs and that. I don't know if we're the only ones left on the call. I think there's a few left, but
Probably are.
we recorded all this, so we have this for posterity. But I really appreciate it. That was wonderful. That was great.
Yeah, we still got 17 people left, so either they fell asleep, died, or gave up. I don't know which. They probably just left the computer on, so they didn't want to be rude.
Exactly. Hey, but before I want to thank Belisle Nutrition, Scothorn Nutrition, Truro Agromart for helping sponsor all this. Because this was really good, eh? I really enjoyed this. I even understood some of it, so I was pretty excited. Yeah.
What are your take-home points?
Oh, say that again.
What are some of your take-home points?
Well, I tell you, I love the stuff on butyric, and I know it's pretty basic forage managing in that, but that's the questions I get asked the most, and how can we reduce butyric? So you covered it very well, and you know, all the stuff on digestibility and that was wonderful, no question at all. But the butyric stuff is really what I see day in and day out. How can we make better forages with less butyric, which is all just managing better quality forages.
And you guys in the Maritimes have a tendency to make, I think, be a little more predisposed to it because of how you're harvesting, the seasons that you have. It's a little trickier to make feed. You have that tendency to make that a little bit more. And you think about it, Ireland and UK would be the butyric capital of the world if they could really grow alfalfa.
Okay.
But they really don't. So they can get away with things a little bit easier than what we can. And then here's one thing to remember. Do you know what the CFUs we typically put on as an inoculant?
I don't.
Okay, and that's okay. Normally, the cheapest, smallest inclusion are around 100,000 CFUs.
Okay.
The ones I like to see for haylage and trickier forages around that 200 to 250. I like to use like 400 to 500,000 Buchneri on real tricky high moisture corns or different types of forages. But one thing that I know for sure with that is the Europeans, they're putting 1 million on.
Wow.
1,000, not 1 million, but 1,000 CFUs. We're putting on 200 at the most of the time. Their main inoculants are at 1,000 CFUs per gram.
Wow.
So if we put on 1,000, I would guarantee if we put 500 CFUs per gram of a front end inoculant in the Maritimes, our butyric levels would drop precipitously. Because the way our applicators are anymore, those ones in Europe are still using the big, huge, high gallon, high volume water ones. So they're getting proper dispersion and proper coverage, where sometimes I worry that we're at the race to the bottom, not on price, on CFUs and application rate.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay. So Amber, any questions or any thoughts there, Amber, as my co-host?
I don't see any questions that came up. You know, I really appreciate this whole talk too. And like I said, I think the timing is perfect. And really everyone should just go look at their forage samples and see how we've been doing and how we can improve. Because like you said at the beginning, your forage quality really sets your bar on how you're going to produce or how cheaply you're going to be able to produce milk.
Yeah. How did you stay awake?
Awake.
During the presentation.
It was good. It was easy to stay awake.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. To me, it's a complete honor, and I look forward to building this relationship that we have up in the Maritimes and working more with you guys.
No, for sure, John. We really appreciate it too. You take care, travel safe, and we'll be in touch.
Merci. Thank you.
Okay.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.